Welcome back to My Seminary Life. I'm your host, Brandon Knight, and this is the second of two missionary interviews as part of my current class. I'm in a class on intercultural ministry for those of you who are dropping in for the first time, learning about how there are different cultures around the world, different worldviews, different perspectives, and what better way to get some insight into what those different cultures look like and also what God is doing around the world than to talk to a couple missionaries. And today I have an old college buddy of mine, Nate Harley, is here to talk to us about missions in Uruguay. So, Nate, welcome to the show.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
I want you to know this is a historic episode because you are the first international guest. I am recording this in my frozen home in Northwest Indiana, and you are in Uruguay right now. What's the weather like in Uruguay currently?
Yes, it's starting to get toasty. Well, congratulations on your first international call. It's a big deal.
Oh, thank you.
But yeah, with it being in the Southern Hemisphere, we have the opposite seasons. So yeah, getting warm.
It has snowed for the past 48 hours here. Very light. So we only have like half an inch of snow at the moment, maybe an inch by the time this is all done. But yeah, we're like in full winter mode right now.
Wow,
but you're just quick. Now getting into summer, huh?
Yeah. November is pretty early to be getting into it like that.
Yeah. We usually have like flurries here and there. Thanksgiving is always nasty. In Northwest Indiana. It's always cold and gross. But like the amount of time it has snowed the past couple days, yeah, it's that's not normal.
Yeah, anyway, like in Ohio, it feels like our Christmases are always brown. They're not white, and then we have like white Easter and white Thanksgiving. I'm not sure why that is, but
yeah, I would agree with that. Christmas is always real green around here, but you know, it could snow on Easter. It snowed on my birthday before at the end of March. The Midwest is weird.
It is. Yeah, it keeps you on your toes.
It does. All right. Well, let's jump right into this. So, Nate, you are a missionary in Uruguay serving with SIM. Why don't you tell us a little bit, what is SIM and what are you doing in Uruguay?
Great questions. First of all, I'm originally from Ohio. I mentioned that already. So yeah, we went to your college, Grace College, which is awesome. Mm-hmm. And been married to Luisa for almost 3 years. She's Uruguayan, which is cool. So that's one of the great reasons to stay at this point. But yeah, SIM or SIM, it's a missions organization. I think they have 4,000 workers around the world. But first of all, SIM actually doesn't stand for anything anymore. That's the first question that you get. It started as Sudan Interior Mission in 1893 or something like that. But since it's all over the world now, the letters don't officially mean anything. But yeah, the main distinctives of SIM really speak to my heart specifically. I think two major parts of SIM's identity that set it apart are its emphasis on multicultural teams. So SIM workers we're in 70 different countries, and we're also from 70 different countries.
Okay.
So yeah, SIM works to make receiving offices into sending offices, if that makes sense. So I think that's super cool. SIM really it's led the way, kind of in that shift away from the historic reality of missions are from the West to the rest kind of thing. So,
okay, sure.
Yeah. So in my case, on the Uruguay, SIM Uruguay team, I'm the only gringo. I'm the only full American. Everyone else is from a different Latin American country. So yeah, I think that obviously has many advantages when it comes to seeing things in different ways.
Sure. So first off, I remember that joke from when couple of years ago when you were raising support, you were like, yeah, these letters don't mean anything anymore. Yeah. I remember though that it started with Sudan, right? That was like the original point. Okay. So you're talking about how this is like a multicultural approach, not the the West going to the rest, kind of a colonization looking approach to mission work, but rather getting into the culture and working with the culture and the people there. So would it be safe to say, this is just my assumption, I don't know how this works at all, how do you do that? Is that like discipleship, how you like build that core group of people to then reach the rest?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, I would say. So, I mean, really, not only are we in a different culture, but like everyone on the team can be from, yeah, many different places. So you have the dynamic of trying to contextualize yourself in the gospel and things to where you are, the average local person. But also, yeah, you're working on a team of people that are see things differently, or they relate to people differently. They have different methodologies. So I think number one, it's recognizing that it's a challenge. But yeah, I think the best thing is to recognize what you have in common, the essentials. Like we have this common mission, and it's super important, obviously, to have humility, to recognize that something may seem like an absolute, or yeah, this is definitely the way it is, or even may feel like a biblical truth that if you look through the pages, you might not find it actually is an American thing or whatever. And so, yeah, humility is the biggest thing, I think.
Okay. I was going to ask you this question, but I was going to ask you this question later on, but you're already kind of knocking at the door. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you this now. We'll come back to other stuff in a moment. One thing that has come up in this class is that when it comes to cultures and the gospel, there are times when the gospel confronts the culture. Like you said, you turn through the pages and whatever the culture is doing is not actually there. And so the gospel confronts culture. But there are also times where cultures apply scripture differently. Not in an incorrect way, but just different from how we here in the US would apply scriptures. I mean, even in the US, you find different applications. In your experience in Uruguay, how have you seen the gospel confront the culture, and also where have you seen times when when scripture is just applied differently there in Uruguay?
Yeah, that's an interesting couple of questions. I mean, first of all, it's one of the more challenging ones. It's more of an art than a science to try to figure out where it confronts and where it can fit into what a culture is already. So I think even if we were to stop and analyze our own, like you said, we can recognize that certain things just really don't mix well with Jesus' paradigm, and yet seems like other things actually can be used to understand the gospel from a different angle, and maybe there are different angles to the same truth. So, like you said, might be different ways of applying, but it's the same meaning. So I think one thing that I've learned a lot from Uruguayan Christians that is maybe harder to instill in American Christians, and of course we're going to talk about a lot of generalities, but in general in Latin America, people are more collectivist, I guess, and very community oriented. It's very slowed down. Like the pace of everything is slowed down. So I'd say like in the US, in churches, in my experience, you really try to get people to like stay after the service and have coffee and interact. And I'm sure, and it happens to an extent, of course. But in our context, that's why people come to church. And the service is like, it's fine, but really people will stay for a ton of time afterwards, just interacting. And that's what church is.
Interesting.
Literally. And that's what we always preach in the US. Like, this is what church is. It's people and all this stuff. It's not just the service. And here they just get that. You don't really have to beat people over the head with that one.
Interesting. That's interesting. And you are right. That is getting people to stay afterwards for coffee or whatever, or, trying to get people plugged into small groups, life groups, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, that can be like trying to pull teeth for some people, speaking generally. Right. But I think in your context,
sorry, go ahead.
That's just what you do. That's just what you do.
Yeah. I was just going to say, the other major difference that I've noticed that connects with that is just, I guess in the US, typically older people, let's say, they enjoy just sitting and visiting. That's like the activity, just sit and visit. Whereas here in Uruguay, that's everybody from young to old. That's what they like to do, and that can be very
Oh,
challenging, yeah, for an American because we're very activity oriented. I've realized being here, like we say, yeah,
hmm.
let's go play spike ball on the beach. Let's go play, Settlers of Catan. Like we get together for that thing and we do it. Here, you might say we're going to do that, like, yeah, let's go down and play this, but then everyone just ends up getting in a circle and chatting, and they just talk for hours. And these are young people,
Oh,
so it's very bizarre. It takes some getting used to.
interesting.
It can be frustrating if you're like waiting to play the game supposed to be playing. But yeah,
Right.
it's very cool though, and that goes to what you were saying, like being in a small group and interacting. It just seems to come more natural.
That's interesting. Yeah, I could see the frustration of if you were told you're going to play Settlers of Catan and then you ended up sitting and talking. Although personally, I wouldn't mind that. I like the groups that's like, hey, we're just going to hang out and talk for a while.
It's good. You would have a good
Yeah.
time down here then.
Oh, good. I should come down sometime.
Yeah.
So let's back up a little bit here. A couple years. How long have you been there, by the way?
I've actually been here for over 5 years now.
Over 5 years. That's what I
Hmm.
thought. Okay. So a little over 5 years ago, you and we met up at a kind of emo, hot topic looking coffee shop in Valparaiso, Indiana. All the listeners
Yes.
in Valpo, Fluid. Um,
Great name
and
too.
you were talking to me. What'd you say?
Great name too.
It is. It is. I mean, you know what you're getting yourself into at a
Yeah.
coffee shop called Fluid. We met up there because you were certain the support raising process,
Hmm.
and you talked about the need. Why Uruguay? And I want you to tell us all why. Of all the places in the world, what stood out to you about Uruguay? I'm sure you had some type of conviction of the Holy Spirit to go out there, but what's the spiritual need? Why were you drawn to go this direction?
Yeah. Well, I mean, originally I didn't come to Uruguay entirely on purpose, which is not uncommon.
Hmm.
It's basically, part of my intercultural studies program there at Grace, I needed to take a semester with a missions organization. So yeah, picked SIM and gave them my top three choices basically,
Okay.
looking at the country profiles on their site. So I put like Chile, Paraguay, and then Uruguay last because the profile was all about how it was like super hard soil. It was like the graveyard of missions, super
Hmm.
atheistic, widespread mental health issues, like all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's above my pay grade as a 20-year-old. So like someday that'd be good when I'm like more equipped. But
Hmm.
in God's plan and his providence, it just so happens that the other two places could only take someone for a year or more for some reason. But Uruguay
Hmm.
was open to anything, so that's where I ended up. But
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I came back after graduation because I honestly think it's the perfect place to be a missionary right now, like in history.
Okay.
Both, yeah, I think because you have the two realities of this huge need that you mentioned, and it's also pretty stable and pretty safe. I mean, there's no
Hmm.
like physical persecution or risk of to being a Christian or sharing about it.
Okay.
But yeah, but I was particularly motivated by the fact that Uruguay has the highest percentage of non-religious in the Western Hemisphere. So that's more than
Hmm.
Canada. Half the population identifies as atheist or agnostic, and
Wow.
yeah, for a Latin American country, you typically think Catholicism is going to be a big deal, but even that
Sure.
doesn't have much of an influence here. Only 2% of Catholics actually attend Mass. So
Hmm.
yeah, the evangelical or Protestant church is very small, like 6 to 8%. So I
Wow.
think that coupled with Uruguay has the highest yearly depression and suicide rate in all of Latin America. It doubles the international average. So yeah,
Wow.
as you can imagine, COVID isolation did not help with that either. But those
Oh
are
my
some of the
goodness.
negative, yeah, those are some of the negative realities, I guess, that motivate me to be here. In addition to you know otherwise having many positives that make it a nice place to be. But
Sure. Yeah, I remember when we were sitting there talking, you mentioned that it's the graveyard of missions, and it is fascinating to hear, I live here in the US. It's a very Christian type of country. Don't want to say that the United States is a Christian country, but evangelicalism is widespread across the country, and there's other places as well that is just like very high concentrations of some form of Christianity. But to be in a place, it just sounds so old. I don't know, that's not the right word. I don't think it's the right word, but it's so different to hear of a place where it's so small. The percentage of Christians, Catholics represented in a country being so small, in a place, like you said, where you may assume it's actually very vibrant, at least with like Catholics or Pentecostals type of environment. That's
Yeah, it is very interesting. It's super different compared to the other countries around it. But in a positive sense, you kind of have a blank slate with people. Like a lot of people don't have any experience at all with church or Christians, whereas in other places you kind of have to dig down and kind of unlearn things, or people have some negative experiences, obviously, in the US, in church, when they're younger. So I think that is one positive, I guess, to the negative situation.
Yeah, that is a unique situation to be in, of one of the few places where you have a clean slate to work with. You don't have to unlearn things. Like you said, there's not persecution happening in these areas. It's just you get to go in and work. So what is that work that you're... Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to make a comment that I just realized. So I mentioned I heard that it was the graveyard of missions. And I remember saying that once to someone, and they misunderstood me, that I was saying the graveyard of missionaries. But I think that's a great distinction, actually. That's like, actually, it's super safe. It's just the gospel itself is not well liked.
Interesting. And you said that the alternative is mostly atheist or some form of agnosticism. It's not like Islam, or I don't even know, some type of animistic religion, but just atheism in general.
Yeah, it's correct that atheism in general. However, just like in the States, there's certain animistic or Eastern or New Age type religions that kind of are catching. So it's interesting that people that will identify as agnostic or atheist will dabble and believe in the crystals and the energies and the different things like that. So that is interesting. But
that was a fascinating conversation in the class as well, about why does animism, New Age, spiritualism, why does that have such staying power? You would think that would be, paganism, you would think is like some barbaric, but it's alive and thriving in even the most developed of places,
Yeah, and it's like people will believe in anything to not believe in Jesus.
True. That's especially in some form of like paganism, where it's less submitting yourself to divine authority. We'll just put it blank general statement like that. It's less submission to divine authority and more I'm trying to control the supernatural,
Yeah, sure.
So what is the work that you're doing down there? You mentioned you're the only gringo in the group. So what are you doing with everybody else?
Well, my primary role is as associate pastor at a local church that it's about half Uruguayan and half people from all over the world. So there's like 20 some different countries. So it's pretty cool. We do things in both Spanish and English because of that. And yeah, we're actually the only church in the city that has that English component. So it makes it pretty significant for people that arrive. And that's our world. We're very global. So yeah, I mean, small church, small staff. So I do a little bit of everything. I came in directing the worship. I'm in the preaching rotation, organizing courses and groups and pastoral care and all that stuff. It's a long list of stuff, but yeah, people, small churches will understand.
Yeah, I'm sure. So even at, talking about the small percentage of Christians out there, you're not like building a church or, translating the Bible into another language. There is a church, you're an associate pastor, you're doing small church role, basically.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's definitely it's not the jungle. However, I mean, like a good sized church here is we're only talking about a couple hundred people. Is like that's called a big church, right? So ours is about 100, and so it's like some churches, house churches, of course, would consider us a bigger church here in Uruguay. So yeah, that's right.
100 people, based off of those stats you were given earlier, that sounds like a lot of good work going, though.
It's really awesome. I really have enjoyed. I come from a pretty big church in Worcester, Ohio, and I can appreciate aspects of both, of course. But I really appreciate. I like being on a staff where like the pastoral care is like the core of what we do, and it's very, one-on-one and personal, and yeah, feels like bite-sized.
Nice. So you mentioned earlier you've been there now 5-ish years. What were some of you mentioned a few being in this environment where it's more collective, people saying, let's play Settlers of Catan, and then you just sit around and talk and, hang out that way. What were some other cultural differences that you had to adjust to, maybe you're still adjusting to over the past few years?
Sure. Well, first of all, you have to get used to things like personal space, like greeting with the side kiss. So, thankfully, it's not actually a kiss on the cheek. You just put your cheek against theirs and make the sound. But yeah, that takes a lot of getting used to at first, of course, because it's even with men. So, just gotta make sure your beard is well oiled so you're not freaking people out too much. And that, and just sharing mate. Their drink is mate, not coffee. So it's like this strong herbal tea in a gourd, and they have like a metal straw. But they have one for the whole group, and they pass it around. You take your slurp and you pass it back. So some of those things, it takes some getting used to at first. But yeah.
How did? Oh no, go ahead. Finish.
No, I just had another idea. I was thinking about just how, like, I think the most significant cultural value for a Uruguayan is privacy, and that's something I learned later, like as I went along. For example, if let's say I'm doing a band practice or something, and I have you scheduled to come, and you're not able to for some reason, the American would expect you to say, "Hey, you text me, say I'm not able to come," and you give the reason, like I'm sick, I had to go do this thing, whatever. That's like respecting. It feels like I'm respected because you like explained, and it feels like you didn't want to miss. But a Uruguayan, they'll just say, "Hey, I can't come." It says "se me complicó." It's like it just got complicated on me. Like it's not even my fault, and I just say that, and they don't say the reason. So at first, it's like, man, like my cultural assumption is that they don't really care about what I'm trying to do, but for them it's an issue of privacy. So like if I were to be like, "Hey, what happened?" It's like, "Hey, that's my thing. There's a reason I didn't say the reason." So I think that was very interesting to learn along the way and adjust to understand their logic.
I want to say something to that first before I go to my other question. I think it's so fascinating going through this class, we've done a lot of comparisons between American and Eastern cultures, Japanese, South Korea, things like that. And when you do these comparisons, you see these moments where it seems like the culture in of itself is contradicting itself. And I find it interesting that you live in such a collective area that, they literally pass a drink around for everyone to indulge, but you have this privacy element. That's very interesting. To me, I would more so assume that it's like they tell you their whole life story because, we're all part of this group together. Yeah, but instead you just it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting that you point that out. I was thinking about that as well. Just that aspect, the privacy, and yet it's collective, and also there's this issue of, I mentioned obviously depression being a major issue here. So people tend to isolate themselves, and yet that seems to be a contradiction with what I said earlier, right? That people like to be
Sure.
in groups and they're all about community and interacting. And so, yeah, it is interesting to notice some of those things. I think the gospel can cut in to that middle, I think.
Hmm. Yes. Yes. I think that the gospel could encourage of like, yeah, you're doing well. You're supposed to be gathered together, but you also have this challenge of bearing one another's burdens, and like
Mm.
it's okay to be open about these other difficulties. And I tip my hat to you, because I would not know how to bridge that in a context where it's complicated. That's it.
Right. Yeah.
The other
No,
thing
but
I wanted
go ahead.
Another thing I was going to ask you was going back to passing the drink around or greeting one another with a kiss. How did COVID affect all that? I
Mm.
can't imagine it did well.
Well, that it was very bizarre to see, and yeah, I mean, you had to cut all of that out. So people switched to the
Hmm.
fist bump, or the elbow or whatever, um, and mate was basically that was shut down. And so that yeah, like, those are two major parts of their culture. So it was very sad, and people mentioned it, and transitioning back to normal life was even worse because then you didn't know. I'm sure you experienced that to an extent, but you didn't know what to do. You lean in for
Hmm.
the kiss, or you give them the elbow or whatever. So we still have some awkward interactions, I guess, with certain people. But yeah, it was sad to see. It was sad to see because those are two aspects that I think bring them warmth and closeness, and
Hmm.
that's one of the and that has happened all over the world. That forced isolation really had some negative effects on mental health and isolation. So
Hmm.
like I mentioned, that's it like fed into things that people already tended towards. So if they already isolated themselves, and it just it encouraged that even more. But then for the people that
Hmm.
loved the warmth and like you said, the share, it was yeah, pretty challenging.
Sounds like it. Is there is there like a need for counselors, mental health counselors down there? Is that like a thing that needs to happen? Is counseling being brought into the church environment? How would that work? Or do you think that would even work?
Absolutely, Brandon. That would be a dream. Yeah, that's
Okay.
arguably the need um,
Mm.
because again the church is so small here. So then the people that are trained or equipped or to do biblical counseling, uh, it's very very few. Like I have
Mm.
maybe two or three people that I can recommend max to people, and because obviously it's going to be a different experience. A Christian biblical counselor versus um, your run of the mill, again, atheist, agnostic therapist or whatever. And obviously
Okay.
that can be super helpful, but there are also some damaging practices that we've noticed and anecdotally here. But yeah, that would be amazing. We actually praise is that we received a family this year, a missionary family, where
Hmm.
the guy Dave, he's a biblical counselor, and so
Oh.
yeah, that's actually one of the other main motivations, I guess, for being here as a missionary for me is there's no question that there's a need for outside Christian workers, if that makes sense,
Okay.
because for not only to do stuff but to train. Whereas some places like Africa, different places where you wonder like, man, is it worth is it more worth it to send resources,
Okay.
so anyway, that would be a great answer to prayer.
Well, then we will definitely be praying about that. Myself, my wife, uh, the great audience that is listening to this episode right now will definitely be praying about that, because that sounds like one of the biggest needs that you all have down there. And hopefully the Lord will soon send somebody with that training, or start sending you resources to get you
Hmm.
all better trained up, whatever needs to happen there.
Amen.
Is there anything else you would like to share with us about your life there in Uruguay, your missions? Anything else you'd like to share with us?
I mean, there's plenty more, but I think that's okay for now.
Okay. Well, if that's the case, then let's go ahead and start wrapping this episode up. Nate, if somebody wanted to support you, or along with praying for you. We're just going to
Mhm.
assume that we're all going to be praying for you now. If anybody wanted to support you, how would they be able to do that?
Yeah, so thank you in advance for the prayers, of course. And then, yeah, if you wanted to support financially, you could go to simusa.org/give. And you just search Nate Harley, and it should be easy from there.
Awesome. I will put a link for that in the description of this episode, so that way, if you would like to support Nate, you could do that. You can also find links for all the other usual stuff that's in there, the My Seminary Life website, shop, all that stuff. Forget about that stuff right now. If you're looking to support a missionary, you should consider supporting Nate or Jamie from last week. Forget about my t-shirts for a minute. Just give your money to somebody who needs it. Thanks again for listening to this episode. Thank you, Nate, again, for coming out and doing this. Coming out. I'm calling you over the phone. But I appreciate you, man. I'm really hoping to see you here. I know you've got a sabbatical coming up here, December through March. So hopefully we'll be able to connect. You can meet Cooper, who is crying. I don't know if you can hear that in the background right now, but it's bath night, so might need to go out there and help. I like to end every episode, Nate, whenever I have a guest on, I like to end it asking the guest a fun question that really has nothing to do with anything we've talked about.
Okay.
So my question for you is, when you're coming home here shortly, what is like the meal that you're looking forward to the most? I'm sure the food there in Uruguay is great, but what is some USA, Worcester, Ohio food that you're looking forward to getting?
Great question. The food is good here, but maybe it's embarrassing, but definitely Taco Bell. That's my first stop.
I knew you were going to say Taco Bell.
We don't have that here at all or anything close. So, yeah. But,
well, that's another
thanks,
need
Brandon.
we'll be praying for, that Taco Bell shows up in Uruguay.
We need the gospel and Taco Bell. That's what we need.
That's what you need. All right. Well, thanks again for being here, Nate. Thank you all welcome for listening to this episode. And remember, theology is for everybody, so keep on studying.